Some women spend their whole lives shrinking themselves to fit inside a world that was never built for them. Nia Brooks spent 6 years doing exactly that, hiding her body, her voice, her hunger for love, inside a tiny bakery on a rain-soaked street in Seoul. Then one night, a dying man crawled through her window and dragged her straight into the most dangerous criminal war the city had ever seen. What happened next will shock you. Stay until the very end and drop a like. Then comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The rain started around 9. Not the soft, apologetic kind that Seoul sometimes offered in early spring. The kind that whispered against rooftops and made the Han River look like hammered silver. This was the other kind. The kind that came sideways, that turned the gutters into rivers, and drove every sensible person off the streets of Gangseo District and back behind locked doors. Nia Brooks had always been a sensible person. She told herself that often enough that she'd almost started believing it. She was standing at the marble prep counter in the back kitchen of Honey and Hearth, her hands buried wrist-deep in a batch of honey brioche dough, when the bell above the front door chimed. She didn't look up immediately. The shop was technically closed, had been since 8, but she'd forgotten to flip the sign again, and occasionally someone wandered in off the street, confused, looking for a convenience store or a pharmacy. She wiped her hands on the flour-dusted apron stretched across her stomach and called out toward the front in halting Korean. "Closed. Sorry, we open at 7 tomorrow." Nothing. The rain hammered the windows. The fluorescent light above the display case buzzed the way it always did when the weather turned wet. That low electrical hum she kept meaning to get fixed and kept forgetting. The smell of browned butter and cardamom hung thick in the warm air, the residue of 12 hours of baking, and for a moment Nia just stood there with dough cracking between her fingers and let herself feel the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been on her feet since 5 in the morning. Then something hit the floor. Not a knock. Not a stumble. Something heavy, boneless, and final. The sound of a body giving out. She came around the counter fast, faster than she expected herself to move, and stopped dead in the doorway between the kitchen and the front of the shop. A man had collapsed face first onto her black and white tile floor. He was dressed expensively. Even sprawled like that, even soaking the grout between her tiles with rainwater and something darker, she could see that. The clean cut of his black dress shirt, the watch on his wrist catching the light from the display case. He was Korean, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 30s, and he was bleeding from his left side with the methodical, unstoppable patience of a man who had already lost too much to stop losing now. Nia stood there for 3 full seconds. She was not a brave woman. She had never claimed to be. She was a baker from the south side of Chicago who had followed a man she loved to Seoul 4 years ago and then watched that man leave her for someone thinner, someone quieter, someone who did not take up space the way Nia took up space. She had stayed because leaving felt like admitting the failure of everything, and because Honey and Hearth had become hers in a way that nothing else in her life had ever been hers. She was a woman who measured safety in locked doors and early closing times, and the predictable rhythm of yeast rising in warm water. She was not equipped for this. And yet, she crossed the floor in 4 steps, dropped to her knees beside him, and pressed her palm against the wound. He made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a groan, something caught between the two, and his eyes opened. They were dark, almost black, and they focused on her face with a sharpness that didn't belong to a man who was bleeding out on a bakery floor. Like whatever else was failing, his mind hadn't gotten the message yet. "You're going to be okay," she said. It was an automatic thing, the kind of thing you said because silence felt like giving up. She didn't know if it was true. His jaw worked. He said something in Korean too fast and too low for her to catch. "English," she said. "My Korean is English, please, if you can." A pause. Then, very precisely, as if speaking cost him something he couldn't afford to spend, "Don't call the police." Nia looked at the blood soaking through her palm, felt the warmth of it against her skin, and made the worst and best decision of her life. Okay, she said, I won't. She had no medical training. What she had was a first aid kit under the counter that her landlord had required by law, a steady hand developed from years of pastry work, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called her worst quality and her best one simultaneously. She had a clean towel from the linen cabinet and a roll of food-safe wrap she used for dough resting, and enough sense to know that the bullet had gone through. She could see the exit wound when she cut his shirt away, which meant the bleeding was the main problem and not a piece of metal sitting in muscle. She worked in the kitchen. She dragged him there herself, which had not been easy. The man was maybe 6 feet and built like someone who had spent serious time developing the kind of body that was useful in a fight rather than decorative. He was barely conscious but cooperative in the mechanical way of someone operating purely on instinct, pushing with his legs when she pulled, bearing weight on surfaces that could hold it. By the time she had him propped against the cabinet beneath the secondary prep station, she was sweating through her t-shirt and he was the color of old newsprint. This is going to hurt, she said, pressing the folded towel hard against the entry wound. I know, he said. He didn't make a sound when she applied pressure. That was the thing that unnerved her most. Not the blood, not the situation, not the reasonable fear of whoever had put a bullet in him, potentially following him through her door. It was the silence, the absolute controlled silence of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, to keep his pain private. She worked for 20 minutes, cleaned both wounds as best she could with what she had, packed them tight, used the elastic bandaging from the kit, and then reinforced it with the food wrap because she needed compression she couldn't get from the gauze alone. It was ugly work and imprecise, and she knew it, but when she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd done, the bleeding had slowed to something that wasn't immediately catastrophic. He was watching her. She became aware of it gradually, the weight of those dark eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that should have been frightening and somehow wasn't, though she couldn't have explained why. You're not going to call anyone, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I said I wouldn't. Most people would. I'm not most people. She stood up, stripped off the gloves she'd grabbed from the kitchen supply drawer, and dropped them in the trash. Her knees ached. Her back ached. The brioche dough was still sitting on the counter, overproofed now, probably ruined. Who shot you? A long silence. The rain hit the windows. Someone who made a mistake, he said finally. They'll make it again, she said. You should be in a hospital. I can't be in a hospital. I know. You told me. She filled a glass of water at the sink and brought it to him, and he took it without looking away from her face, which was something she was trying not to think about too hard. You're going to need more than this. A real doctor. I have one. He reached into the inside pocket of his ruined shirt with visible effort and produced a phone that somehow hadn't been lost in the chaos of arriving on her floor. He'll come to me. Here? If that's acceptable. Maya looked around her kitchen. The flour on the counters, the cooling racks hung with the morning's leftover pastries, the small hand-painted sign above the doorway that her friend Jolie had made for her the day Honey and Hearth opened. Made with love, served with nerve, and thought about what was acceptable and what was simply what was happening regardless of her opinion on the matter. Fine, she said. Tell him to come to the back entrance, the alley off Gonghang Daero. He looked at her for a moment like she'd said something unexpected. Then he dialed. Yes. The doctor arrived 40 minutes later. He was older, silver-haired, and he walked into her kitchen with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been doing things like this for a long time. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at Nia's patchwork first aid job with an expression she couldn't read, then nodded once like he was conceding a point and got to work. She waited in the front of the shop with the lights off and the rain on the glass and her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she'd made on autopilot, not tasting it. The bell above the door was silent. No one else came through the window. The street outside was empty and wet and reflected the orange smear of the streetlights in broken patterns across the tile floor. Around midnight, the doctor came out. He'll live, he said, in Korean, slowly enough that she caught it. He needs rest. No movement for at least 12 hours. He paused. He said you helped him before I arrived. I did what I could. More than most would. He looked at her with the same unreadable expression. You understand what kind of man he is? She hadn't known. Not then. Not the name or the weight of it. She'd learned that later, in pieces, the way you learn things that were always there, when you finally start asking the right questions. I understand he was bleeding, she said. The doctor left. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the man stretched out on her floor with his eyes closed and his chest moving in the slow, even rhythm of medicated sleep. And she thought, I should have called the police. I should have called an ambulance. I should have done the sensible thing. She didn't. She turned off the kitchen light, locked the back door, and went upstairs to the apartment above the shop where she had lived alone for the past 2 years, and she lay on her bed fully dressed with her ceiling above her, listening to the rain. She didn't sleep for a long time. He was gone when she came down at 5:30. She almost convinced herself it had been a dream. The collapsed man, the blood, the 20 minutes of improvised field medicine on her kitchen floor, except for the stain she hadn't fully gotten up from the grout, and the ruined brioche dough hardened in its bowl on the counter, and the faint impression on the lower cabinet door where someone had been leaning against it for a long time. She opened Honey and Hearth at 7. The morning rush was the part of her day she loved best, or had loved best once, before love for things had started feeling like a reflex rather than a genuine response. The regulars came. The elderly man from the apartment building across the street, who always ordered the same red bean pastry and paid with exact change. The young office workers grabbing honey croissants on their way to the bus stop. The mother who came in 3 times a week with her daughter and let the girl press her face against the display case glass and point at things. Nia knew all their orders. She knew most of their names. She'd built this business on knowing the names, on the intimacy of remembering that Mr. Yoon liked extra honey on his pastry, and that the little girl's name was Soo Yeon, and that she always pointed at the strawberry tart, even though her mother always steered her toward the red bean. It was a small life. Nia had made her peace with that, or she'd tried to. Around 10, between the morning rush and the lunch crowd, she was restocking the display case when a black car pulled up outside. Not unusual. Gonghangdaero was a busy street, people stopped all the time. But this one sat there, engine running, and after a moment the driver's door opened and a man in a dark suit got out and stood on the sidewalk, scanning the storefront with the flat professional attention of someone who'd been sent to look at something rather than buy anything. Nia kept stalking this case. Almond croissants on the left, honey brioche in the center, strawberry tarts in the back row. The suited man spoke into an earpiece, nodded, and got back in the car. The car stayed. It was there when she closed at 6. When she went upstairs, when she looked out her window at 11 that night before turning off the light. In the morning, it was gone. She learned his name 4 days later. Not from him. From her friend and only regular confidant in Seoul, a Korean-American woman named Dana Park, who worked in financial consulting and had the particular gift of knowing things before other people did, which she deployed with the casual precision of someone using a tool she'd spent years sharpening. They were sitting in a cafe 2 blocks from the bakery, the kind of low-lit afternoon meeting that had become their Tuesday ritual, and Dana was doing the thing she sometimes did where she'd been holding information for a while and was now releasing it with theatrical restraint. "Tell me what happened Thursday night," Dana said. "Nothing happened Thursday night. Nia." "I had a late customer." "A late customer." Dana wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who had grown up in a Korean household and then spent a decade in American finance and had thus developed a tolerance for bullshit that was precisely 0. "Kang Min-jae had a late customer, at your bakery, after hours." The name meant nothing to her. The Kang was common and Min-jae was common, and she'd met plenty of people with both names in Seoul. "I don't know what you're talking about." Dana's expression didn't change. She pulled her phone from her bag, opened something, and slid it across the table. It was a news article in Korean with a photograph. A man in a black suit walking through the lobby of what appeared to be a very expensive hotel, flanked by men who were clearly not there for decoration. The photograph was slightly grainy, the kind taken from a distance without permission, but the face was clear enough. She knew that face. She'd watched it sleep on her kitchen floor. Bajo Syndicate, Dana said quietly. You know what that is? I've heard the name. Everyone in Gangseo had heard the name. It was the kind of name that existed in the city the way weather existed. Not something you engaged with directly, just a condition of life that you acknowledged and worked around. He's the head of it? Since his father got sick about 18 months ago. Dana took her phone back. Nia, what happened? She told her. Not everything. Not the 20 minutes of field medicine. Not the doctor in the back entrance. Not the black car watching the street for 2 days afterward. But enough. A man came in after hours. He was hurt. She helped him. Dana was quiet for a long time. You helped Kong Min Jai, she said finally. I helped a man who was bleeding. Those are the same person. At the time, Nia said carefully, I didn't know that. And now that you do, Nia thought about the weight of those eyes, the controlled silence, the single question, you're not going to call anyone, delivered with the precision of someone who understood leverage instinctively and was choosing not to use it anyway. Now I know his name, she said. That's all. Dana looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee, and whatever she was thinking, she kept it to herself. He came back 3 weeks later. She was in the middle of the lunch rush when the door opened and the temperature of the room changed, not literally, but the way it did when something entered a space that rearranged the gravity of it. She was behind the counter, helping a customer decide between the passion fruit tart and the honey walnut roll, and she looked up because she always looked up when the bell rang, and she saw him. He was dressed differently now, still expensively, still in black, but the dress shirt was gone in favor of something dark and structured that suggested armor without being obvious about it. He looked healthy. Whatever the doctor had done, whatever rest he'd gotten wherever he'd gone after leaving her kitchen floor, it had worked. He was upright, broad, and he walked through the door of Honey and Hearth like he'd been there before, which in the most literal sense possible, he had. He stood to one side while she finished with the customer. He didn't look at the display case or the menu board or the framed photographs of Chicago that she'd hung on the east wall when homesickness had gotten the better of her. He looked at her. When the customer left, she came around the counter and stood facing him across the empty space and said, in English because she'd decided English was the ground she could hold better in this conversation, "You look better. I owe that to you," he said. His English was precise, nearly accent-free, with the faint quality of someone who had learned it in classrooms and refined it through practice rather than immersion. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I made a choice." "I know." A pause. "I wanted to tell you myself." "Tell me what?" "That I know what you could have done, and that you didn't." She waited. "The police," he said. "The press. Photographs. Evidence of where I was and how I looked. Any of those things would have had value to a number of people." He was watching her carefully. "You didn't use any of them." "I said I wouldn't call the police. People say things." "I don't," she said. "Not things like that." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. It was a subtle thing, a faint alteration around the eyes. The kind of adjustment that most people would miss. She noticed it because she'd been watching his face since he walked in, and she was still watching it now, which was something she was choosing not to examine too carefully. "Can I sit?" he asked. She stared at him. "I'd like coffee," he said. "If that's possible." "You came for coffee." "I came to say what I said," he replied. "The coffee is separate." She made him an Americano because that seemed like the right call. No sweetness, no ceremony, just the straight thing. And brought it to the small table by the window where he'd seated himself with his back to the wall, which she noticed without commenting on. She sat across from him because standing over him felt performative, and sitting next to him felt like something else entirely, and she needed a position that was just neutral ground. "Your bakery," he said, looking around. "How long?" "3 years. You're from Chicago." The photographs gave it away. A faint movement at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, something in the neighborhood of one. "My mother was from there," he said. "She died when I was young. My father moved us here when I was 5. She hadn't expected that. The information was too personal, too unguarded for the conversation they were having, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." They drank coffee. The lunch rush had thinned and the shop was quiet around them, the low electronic buzz of the overhead light and the distant sound of the street. Nia was aware, hyper-aware, in the way she got sometimes, the way her body registered things before her mind caught up, that there were 2 men in a black car outside who had arrived when he arrived and would leave when he left. She was aware that she should be afraid. She wasn't. She was something else, something that didn't have a clean name. He came back the next day, and the day after that. It became a thing that happened the way things that have no business becoming routine somehow do anyway. He would arrive at different times, sometimes mid-morning, sometimes late afternoon, never during the peak rush hours, which she suspected was intentional. And he would sit at the same table by the window and order the same Americano, and they would talk. Not about his work, not about what he was. The conversations moved sideways, the way 2 people feel each other out when neither of them is willing to be the first one to say what they actually mean. He asked about the bakery, about Chicago, about the brioche, which he ordered once on his 4th visit and ate in silence with the focus of someone for whom eating had long since stopped being about pleasure and had become about fuel. She asked about Seoul, about which neighborhoods he grew up in, about what it was like to lose a language and then come back to it, which she was doing in reverse, Korean coming in pieces, slow and frustrating and occasionally humiliating in the specific way of adult language learning. She did not ask about the scar she'd helped create on his left side. She could see it sometimes, a faint tension in how he held himself, the ghost of a wound still healing. He did not ask why she was alone, why the apartment above the bakery had no photographs of family or friends on the walls. She'd seen his men come in once when he wasn't there, assessing the place, and she knew they'd reported back. He knew more about her than she'd directly told him. She found she didn't mind. That was the part that scared her. Not the men in the cars, not the knowledge of what he was. The fact that she didn't mind, that she'd started looking up when the bell above the door rang and feeling something close to relief when it was him. She'd been that way before, once. With a man who'd called her beautiful and meant it right up until he didn't, right up until the moment someone smaller and quieter and more convenient came along. She knew what happened to women who felt that kind of relief when a certain man walked in. She knew exactly where that road ended, so she kept her distance. She was warm because warmth was her nature, and she'd never figured out how to turn it off. But she kept the table between them and the conversation in the middle space between strangers and friends, and she told herself it was enough. She told herself that often enough that she almost believed it. Well, what? The trouble started on a Tuesday in late March. She'd been aware of it building for weeks. The shift in the street outside, the way certain storefronts had begun boarding up their windows, the whispered conversations among her regulars about payments and demands, and names she recognized as connected to the violence that lived beneath the surface of the district. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where that kind of pressure was familiar, where protection money had a different name but the same mechanics, and she knew the signs of a territory being squeezed. She knew who was doing it too. Dana had told her, in the careful way that Dana had, without saying anything directly accusatory, a man named Jung Tae-hyun, who ran a rival operation called the Cheongsa Group, and who had been systematically moving through Gangseo for 3 months, consolidating debt and extracting compliance through whatever combination of incentive and threat seemed most efficient. She thought it wouldn't come to her. Honey and Hearth was small. The profit margins on a specialty bakery were absurd in either direction, and she told herself no serious operation wanted the trouble of targeting a business that barely cleared its rent. She was wrong. They sent 2 men on a Tuesday afternoon. She was alone. Her part-time assistant, a college student named Bora, had left at 2, and the lunch rush was done, and the shop was in the quiet stretch of mid-afternoon that she usually used for prep work and inventory. The 2 men came in together, moving with the synchronized casual menace of people who had practiced this, and one of them took a position by the door while the other came to the counter. He was young. Early 20s, she thought, with the kind of face that hadn't settled into itself yet, and might have been handsome in a different context. He put his hands on her counter and leaned on them and smiled at her in a way that had nothing to do with friendliness. He spoke in Korean. She caught fragments. She was always catching fragments, always assembling the language in incomplete and frustrating pieces. But the gist was clear in any language. New arrangement, monthly payment. The number he named was 1/3 of her monthly revenue. He said a name she recognized, Chong-sa. She looked at his hands on her counter. She thought about the counter, how she'd saved for 6 months to have it resurfaced, how the marble had been her one serious extravagance, the thing she'd decided the bakery deserved because she deserved it, because building a thing from scratch in a foreign city while rebuilding yourself from scratch was work that warranted one beautiful surface to work on. No, she said. The young man's smile didn't change. He said something else, still in Korean, something that included a specific word she did know. Hayo, which was close enough to a threat that the context made it unambiguous. I said no, Nia said. Her voice was flat, flatter than she expected, given that her heart was working hard enough that she could feel it in her ears. Take your hands off my counter and get out of my shop. He laughed. He said something to the man by the door, who also laughed. Then he reached out and knocked a small rack of cellophane-wrapped brioche off the edge of the counter onto the floor, a gesture so deliberately casual that it was its own kind of violence. And he said, in English, slowly and clearly, and with the precision of someone who wanted to be absolutely certain he was understood. Friday, before noon. Or we come back and the conversation is different. They left. She stood behind her counter for a long time after the bell above the door stopped ringing. She looked at the brioche on the floor. She breathed very carefully, through her nose, the way she did when she needed to not feel what she was feeling, and then she picked up the brioche and restocked the rack, and went into the back and sat on the step stool and put her face in her hands and let herself be afraid for exactly 2 minutes. Then she got up and started the afternoon prep. She didn't tell Min Jae. She told herself she wouldn't, and she meant it. She was not a woman who needed rescuing, and she was not going to walk into the next time he came to her counter and say, "Someone threatened me," fix it like some kind of script from a story where the helpless woman finally finds her powerful man. She had dealt with worse than 2 young men with borrowed confidence. She had survived a broken engagement and an ocean crossing and 3 years of building a business from nothing. She could handle a Friday deadline. She started making calls instead. To her landlord, who was useless. To the district business association, who were afraid. To the one person at the police station she'd spoken to once about a minor break-in and who told her very politely that he understood the situation and would note it in the file. Thursday night, she didn't sleep much. Friday morning, she opened the bakery at 7 and spent the hours before noon in the strange, suspended alertness of waiting for something. She baked. She served customers. She restocked the display case. She watched the clock. They didn't come by noon. They came at 1:15, which was 30 minutes after Bora had arrived, which she didn't think was coincidence. This time, there were 3 of them. The young man from Tuesday and 2 others who were older and carried themselves differently, with the weight of people who weren't making a point anymore, just fulfilling a function. They came in and the room changed the way it had changed when Min Jae first walked in. Except that time the change had been about gravity, and this time it was about pressure. Bora, Nia said quietly, without looking away from the 3 men. Go in the back and start on the afternoon sourdough. Nia, please. Bora went. The young man, she'd started thinking of him as the Tuesday man, which was reductive but efficient, came to the counter again and put his hands on the marble again, and this time there was no smile. He named a figure that was higher than Tuesday's figure. He named a date that was already passed. He spoke for about 30 seconds in Korean and then switched to English for the last sentence. Or we shut you down ourselves. Nia put both her hands flat on the counter, mirroring him, and looked him in the face. She was afraid. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, because she'd spent too many years mistaking stubbornness for courage, and they were not the same thing. She was afraid. Her hands were not steady. She could feel the fine tremor in them, had pressed them to the counter partly to hide it. And her voice, when she spoke, was going to have to carry more steadiness than she actually had. "I heard you Tuesday," she said. "My answer is the same." His face changed. The thin professionalism of it dropped away, and something uglier came up underneath. The specific ugliness of a young man who'd been told he was important and was now encountering resistance that made him feel the opposite of important. He said something in Korean she didn't catch. He reached out. He put his hand around her wrist, and the front door opened. She didn't see him come in. She felt the shift in the room, again, that gravitational thing, but bigger this time, denser. And then the Tuesday man's grip on her wrist loosened, and she looked up and Min-jae was standing in the middle of her shop. He wasn't alone. There were men behind him, 3 of them, and unlike the Tuesday man's companions, these 3 did not need to do anything to communicate what they were. They simply existed in the space, and the space reorganized around them. Min-jae looked at her wrist, at the Tuesday man's hand, at Nia's face. A complete assessment, maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked at the Tuesday man with an expression so completely free of feeling that it was more frightening than rage would have been. He said 3 sentences in Korean. She didn't catch all of them. She caught enough, a name, Jung Tae-hyun, a phrase that included the word for message, and at the end something that was structured like a question, but in the delivery was not a question at all. The Tuesday man's hand dropped from her wrist. His face had gone the color of old flour. He and his 2 companions left. They moved fast, not running, but the Korean verb for what they did was close enough. Min-jae watched them go. Then he turned to Nia. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked at her wrist. There was a red mark that would probably purple by evening. "How did you know?" "I didn't," he said. "I came for coffee." She stared at him. He looked back at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she thought, he's lying. And then she thought, he's not. And then she thought, I can't tell the difference, and that matters. And then she thought maybe it doesn't, and that was the thought that frightened her most. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make the coffee." She went to the machine. Her hands were still not entirely steady. She heard him settle into his usual chair, the small sound of it, and she thought about the wrist and the Tuesday man's face when he'd turned around, and the way 3 sentences in a bakery had accomplished what a Friday deadline and a police report and a landlord call had not. She brought him the coffee and sat across from him and didn't say anything for a moment. "It'll happen again," she said finally. "He'll send different people." "No," Min-jae said. "He won't." She looked at him. "Chongsa Group doesn't operate in Gangseo," he said. It was the simplest sentence, delivered with the simplest certainty, like a man stating a geographic fact. "They know that. Taehyun's enforcers came here because someone thought the rules had changed." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I've clarified. In 3 sentences. In 3 sentences to men who will carry those sentences back to the right people." He looked at her across the table. "Is that a problem for you?" She thought about it. The honest version of the answer was complicated. The version she could say out loud was simpler. "I don't know yet." He accepted that, didn't push, drank his coffee. They sat in the changed afternoon light of honey and hearth, and outside a black car idled on the wet street, and the brioche in the back went past its rest time and had to be reshaped. And Nia watched the man across from her and understood that something had shifted in the architecture of her days without her permission. She understood it, and she didn't know what to do with it, and she let it sit there between them like everything that hadn't been said yet, like everything that was gathering. She didn't know that in 2 weeks, in the marble lobby of the Han River Suites, he would take her arm in front of 500 of Seoul's most powerful and most dangerous, and ask her to become his. She didn't know that the city was already watching. She didn't know, yet, that some offers change everything you think you know about yourself, and that the hardest part isn't the danger. The hardest part is wanting to say yes. The proposal didn't come the way she expected. She'd been expecting, if she was honest with herself, and she was trying to be something theatrical, something that matched the weight of what he was, the scale of the world he operated in. She'd been bracing for it, without knowing she was bracing, for the 2 weeks that followed the Tuesday men leaving her bakery with their tails tucked and their faces the color of old flour. What she got instead was a Thursday afternoon in early April, with rain again. Seoul in spring was nothing but rain. She'd stopped being surprised by it. And Min Jae sitting at his usual table with his second Americano going cold in front of him, and a silence that had a different texture than their usual silences. She noticed it. She noticed most things about him now, which was its own kind of problem. The way he held his cup. The particular stillness of him when he was thinking through something versus the particular stillness of him when he was simply existing in a space. The difference between his eyes when he was listening and his eyes when he had already decided. Right now, his eyes had the quality of something decided. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay." He looked at the table for a moment. Not like he was gathering courage. She didn't think he had the conventional relationship with courage that most people did. She didn't think it cost him the way it cost ordinary people, but like he was deciding on the cleanest way through. "My father is dying," he said. She said nothing. The rain hit the window. "Pancreatic cancer. He has 4 months, maybe 6. He picked up the cup, set it back down without drinking. He built the Baeko Syndicate over 30 years. What he built does not transfer cleanly. There are people inside it who believe I'm too young, too untested. There are people outside it who are watching to see if the transition creates an opening." A pause. "A man in my position is easier to challenge when he appears to have no anchor, no permanence." "Min Jae, I'm not finished." He said it without sharpness, just precision. "I've thought about this carefully. I'm not coming to you without having thought about it." She closed her mouth. "I need a fiancé," he said, "someone I appear committed to, someone who anchors the public understanding of who I am and where I intend to go." He looked at her directly now, the full weight of it. "I want that to be you." The shop was very quiet. Somewhere in the back, the proofing oven made its low mechanical hum. "You're serious," she said. "I don't ask things I'm not serious about." Nia stood up. She needed to be moving. She couldn't have this conversation sitting still, couldn't hold all the things she was feeling in a body that was staying in one place. She walked to the counter and put her back to it and looked at him across the length of her own shop and felt the particular absurdity of the moment with her whole chest. "Do you hear yourself?" she said. "Yes." "You want me to pretend to be engaged to you, to stabilize your position in a criminal organization. The engagement would be real," he said. "I'm not asking for a performance. That's worse." "I know." She pressed both hands flat on the counter behind her. The marble was cold. She thought about the marble, how she'd saved for it, how she'd made exactly one serious extravagance, and this was it. She thought about all the ways a woman could find herself standing in a place she hadn't expected. "I'm a black woman from Chicago," she said. "I run a bakery. I don't speak enough Korean to order plumbing repairs without my phone. I have no family here, no connections, no—" She stopped. "Your world would eat me alive." "My world has been trying to eat me alive for 30 years, Min Jae said. "It hasn't succeeded." "You were born in it. You survived 3 years building a business alone in a city where you didn't speak the language." He said it without inflection, without the particular quality of a compliment, just as a fact being placed alongside another fact. "Survival is not about the context you were born into." She stared at him. "I'm not asking you to become someone else," he said. I'm asking you to stand next to me. Why me? She heard how it sounded the second it came out and hated the sound of it, the smallness of it, the echo of every time she'd asked a version of that question and gotten an answer that eventually turned into a cruelty. I mean, there are women in your world who would understand what this is, who know the rules, who— I know those women, he said flatly. I've known them my whole life. He picked up the coffee cup again. You're the only person in Seoul who saw me bleeding on a floor and didn't try to use it. The room stayed quiet. That's not a reason to get engaged, she said. It's the only reason that matters to me. He set the cup down. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but I needed you to know. She looked at him for a long time. I need to think, she said. I know. I mean, actually think. Not tonight think. Days. Take them. He left shortly after, and she stood in the middle of honey and hearth for a long time, with her hands hanging at her sides, and the rain on the glass and the proofing oven humming in the back. And she thought about what it meant to be asked, and what it meant to want to say yes, and what it meant that the wanting scared her more than anything else. She called Dana that night. Dana listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode and indicated the severity with which she was taking the information. When Nia finished, the silence on the line lasted about 4 seconds. Tell me you said no, Dana said. I said I needed to think. Nia, I know. Do you? Because I need to be sure you actually know. And this isn't one of those situations where you know intellectually, but you're doing the thing where you— Dana, convince yourself that this time is different because the man is different, and maybe you're just— Dana. Louder. Silence. He's not Marcus, Nia said. Her voice was even. She'd worked to make it even. Marcus was her ex-fiancé's name, and she didn't say it often, and when she did, it sat in her mouth like something that had spoiled. I know he's not Marcus. I'm not confused about what this is. What is it then? Tell me what it is. She stood at her kitchen window above the bakery, looking down at the wet street. The black car was not there tonight. That was new. He'd pulled the surveillance after the Cheongsa incident or moved it somewhere less visible, which was either reassurance or the opposite. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Okay? Dana's voice shifted, dropped into the register she used when she was done being alarmed and switching to being useful. Then let's talk about what you do know. What does saying yes actually look like? Exposure, Nia said immediately. His world, his events, his people. I'd be visible in spaces I have no preparation for. What does saying no look like? The same life I already have. Which is, Nia didn't answer. The street below was empty and wet, and the streetlight was doing its broken reflection thing on the pavement, and she was 32 years old in an apartment above a bakery she loved that also sometimes felt like the walls were very close. Don't answer that, Dana said, softer. I already know the answer. It's not a bad life. I didn't say it was. I'm not saying yes because I'm lonely, Dana. I want to be clear about that. I know. Another pause. Are you saying yes? Nia thought about his face across the table. The way he'd said, I don't ask things I'm not serious about. Not as seduction, not as strategy, just as the simplest available truth. She'd been lied to by men who knew how to make things sound like simple truth, and she knew the difference. She'd learned it the hard way, and the thing was, this didn't feel like that. I don't know yet, she said again, but she did. She knew before she slept that night, lying on her back with the ceiling above her and the rain finally stopping, the quiet that came after rain like an exhale. She knew. She was just giving herself time to argue with it. She told him yes on a Saturday. She came around the counter when he arrived, which broke the routine of the last month, and she stood in front of him at a distance that was closer than their usual distance, and she said, There have to be rules. His expression didn't change. He was very good at that. This doesn't become you controlling my life, she said. My bakery stays mine. My schedule stays mine. I go where you need me when you need me, but Honey and Hearth doesn't close and I don't disappear. Agreed. I need to be able to say no to things. Specific things, situations that I need to know I can say no. You can always say no to me. She looked at him hard, trying to find the angle in it. There wasn't one she could see. If this stops making sense, she said, for either of us, we end it. Without damage. You don't make it complicated. Agreed. I'm serious, Minjai. I know you are. He looked back at her with the same direct, undecorated attention he'd had since the beginning. So am I. She nodded, once, short. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. That was the engagement. No ring? Not yet. No theater. Just two people looking at each other across a bakery floor and agreeing to something that neither of them could fully name yet. She thought, this is either the bravest thing I've ever done or the most catastrophic. She thought, maybe those are the same thing. The gala was 3 weeks later. The invitation, she learned this from the woman Min Jae sent to help prepare her, a small, precise person named Ms. Cho, who spoke in complete sentences and wore her efficiency like body armor, was to the Baekho Syndicate's annual spring event, held at the Han River Suites. Black tie. The guest list included every significant figure in Seoul's organized criminal hierarchy, plus a carefully curated selection of legitimate business contacts who understood the value of adjacency to power. 300 people, maybe more. Ms. Cho arrived at the bakery on a Wednesday with a garment from a designer whose name Nia didn't recognize, and two women from a salon Nia had never heard of, and the brisk professional energy of someone who had been given a task and intended to complete it efficiently. Nia let them work and kept her face neutral and didn't say the thing she was thinking, which was, whatever you put me in, I will still look like me. I will still be a plus-size black woman from Chicago in a room full of people who are going to look at me like I'm a mistake. The dress, when it was finally on her, was not what she'd expected. It was deep burgundy, which, against her dark skin, was... She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and breathed, and the word she found for it was armor. Not in the way of hiding, in the way of inhabiting. It was cut for her body the way it actually existed, and not the body someone might prefer she had. And whoever had done that had done it deliberately, which meant Min Jae had specified it, which was a thing she was going to have to think about later, somewhere private, when she had room to feel things. Ms. Cho looked at her in the mirror and for the first time since Wednesday morning, let something through her professional surface. Something that was close to satisfaction. Ready? She said. It wasn't a question. I'll see. The hotel lobby was white marble and gold light and the kind of silence that expensive spaces manufacture to remind you what everything cost. Min Jae met her at the entrance. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which contained more than most conversations she'd had in the last year. He offered his arm. She took it. The ballroom was on the 42nd floor, and the elevator ride up was the longest 30 seconds of her life. She was aware of the men around them, the security presence that moved with Min Jae the way weather moves with a storm system, subtle and total. She was aware of her own heartbeat. She was aware of his hand warm through the fabric of his jacket sleeve, the solidity of the arm she was holding. The doors opened. The room was full and glittering and loud. And then it wasn't loud because the sound moved through it in a wave, conversation to murmur to near silence. And that wave was them. Was her. She felt it like a physical thing, the attention of 300 people redirecting, and she kept her spine straight and her chin level and her grip on his arm steady, and she walked into it. She heard things. She was meant to hear some of them. The Korean came at her in fragments, the way it always did, partial and slipping, but she caught enough. A woman near the bar said something with the word Miguk, American, wrapped in a tone that needed no translation. A man near the center tables laughed at something she didn't catch, but the laugh was a specific kind, the kind that was commentary. Min Jae's arm didn't tighten. He didn't react. He moved through the room with the same absolute groundedness he brought to everything, greeting people with the minimal precision of a man who understood exactly how much of himself to give to each interaction. And she followed and smiled and held herself together. The cruelties were mostly subtle. The wives of the senior men, the daughters of the old families, they had the particular sophisticated viciousness of women who had learned to weaponize the social form. One of them, a beautiful woman in her 40s in a white gown, took Nia's hand during an introduction and held it a beat too long while looking at Minjai with an expression that delivered its message without a single direct word. Another said something about Nia's dress, something with the structure of a compliment and the content of an insult, which she knew because Dana had once spent an hour explaining to her the Korean formulation for that specific move. She smiled. She said the few Korean phrases she'd been practicing. She let nothing through the smile. She was very good at not letting things through. She'd had years of practice. But things get in anyway. That's the thing about defense. It doesn't actually stop the impact. It just delays the processing. The comment about her size, delivered by a woman who thought Nia's Korean wasn't good enough to catch it, which it wasn't, except she caught it anyway. The deliberate turning of backs. The moment when Minjae was pulled aside by a senior figure and she was left standing alone at the edge of a conversation she hadn't been addressed in, visible and unseen simultaneously, which was a feeling she recognized from the whole of her childhood and had come to Seoul to escape. She made it 2 hours. Then she put her glass down on a passing tray, and she found a door that opened onto a service corridor, and she followed it until it opened onto a back stairwell, and she went down 3 flights and out through a fire exit into the alley behind the hotel. The rain had started again. She stood in it and let it hit her and didn't try to protect the dress, which was probably a significant loss in financial terms, but she couldn't make herself care about that right now. She heard the door behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the sound of him. She'd learned the sound of him without meaning to. He came to stand beside her in the alley, and the rain came down on both of them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was even. She'd made it even. "I needed air." "Take as much as you need. The dress is getting ruined. It's fabric." She turned her head to look at him. He was looking straight ahead, at the wet alley and the rain hitting the pavement in that particular Seoul rain way, relentless and indifferent, and somehow beautiful if you were in the mood to find things beautiful, which she was not currently. Something was building in her chest. She'd felt it all night, behind the smile and the correct Korean phrases and the practiced not reacting. And now with the cold rain and the dark alley and 2 hours of pretending pressing against the inside of her, it ran out of room. "Nobody marries a woman like me," she said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. Flatter and raw and more honest than she'd meant to be. He turned to look at her. "I know what they were saying in there," she continued. "I caught more than they thought I did. And the things I didn't catch. I've been in rooms like that before. Rooms where I was the wrong body, wrong voice, wrong everything. I know what it looks like." She stopped, pressed her lips together, kept going. "I was 12 years old the first time a boy told me that girls who looked like me didn't get chosen. 12. And I've been hearing some version of that every year since, in every shape it comes in, from people who thought they were being subtle and people who didn't bother. The rain. And then Marcus, my ex, the man I followed to Seoul for, he didn't say it the way boys do at 12. He said it slowly, over 2 years, by looking past me at other women at restaurants and making comments about what I ate, and one day just not coming home. She exhaled. And I built this bakery because the bakery was something I could control. I could make beautiful things inside it, and the beautiful things didn't care what I looked like making them. She looked at him directly. "And then you walked into it, or fell into it, and asked me to walk into a room with 500 people who were going to—" She stopped. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled flatness, not the faint, almost smile. Something underneath those, something that had been there all along and was now, in the rain and the dark, simply present. "I didn't want a trophy," he said. "I know what you said. I wanted someone who looked at a bleeding man on her floor and made a choice that cost her something. His voice was even, but it was something else, something with weight behind it. I've been surrounded by people my whole life who make calculations. Every interaction is an exchange. Every gesture has a price. My father taught me to live like that. The people in that room lived like that. He stopped. You didn't calculate. You just chose. The rain was in her hair, on her shoulders. The burgundy dress was soaked through. Nia. He said her name like he'd said it before, like it had always been in his mouth somewhere. I'm going to prove them wrong. Every person in that room. I don't need their approval and I don't want it, and I chose you not despite what they think, but without giving any weight to what they think, because their opinions have never been worth the breath it takes to hear them. She stared at him. And I am asking you, he said, to let me. The alley around them was wet and dark and smelled of rain and city, and somewhere above them 300 people were drinking champagne and talking about them, and it didn't matter. It was very far away. It was nothing. He kissed her. She kissed him back. It was not a graceful thing. The rain made it rain wet, and her hands came up without her deciding to, and she felt his hands, one at her jaw, one at her waist. And it wasn't graceful, but it was true. It was the truest thing that had happened to her in a very long time. When they broke apart, she had her forehead against his, and the rain was running down both their faces, and she thought, this is the most beautiful and most dangerous thing I have done in Seoul. She thought, I have just made myself a target. She thought, I don't care. She was wrong about the last part, not about wanting it. She wanted it with a force that frightened her, but about not caring about the danger. Because the danger was already in motion before either of them understood it fully, already running through channels they couldn't see yet. Upstairs, in a corner of the 42nd floor ballroom, a man named Park Seung-ho stood with his second whiskey and watched the door Min-jae had used to follow her out. He watched it for a long time. Then he took out his phone and typed a message to a number that was not saved under any name. He's committed. The woman is the way in. He put the phone back in his pocket, finished the whiskey, and smiled at the next person who approached him, warm and practiced and giving nothing. Park Seung-ho had worked for Kang Min-jae for 11 years. That was the number Nia kept returning to in the days after she learned his name. Not the facts of what he'd done, not the specific mechanics of the betrayal, but that number. 11 years. Longer than most marriages. Longer than most of the legitimate relationships she'd watched dissolve around her. 11 years of standing at the right hand of the Baeko Syndicate's leadership, first under Min-jae's father, and then under Min-jae himself, and apparently every one of those years had been a calculation so patient and so complete that no one inside the organization had seen the edges of it. She learned his name 6 days after the gala. She learned it the way she learned most things about Min-jae's world. Sideways, incomplete, in pieces that she had to assemble herself because the direct version was either too dangerous to deliver or too dangerous to receive. The 6 days between the alley kiss and the morning, she woke up to 3 missed calls from Dana and a text that said, "Only call me now. Do not open the bakery yet." Were the strangest 6 days of her life in Seoul. Strange because they were, on the surface, ordinary. Min-jae came to the bakery. They talked. The quality of the talking had changed. There was less distance in it. Something had opened up that the rain had opened and that neither of them was working to close again. And she moved through her days with the particular heightened awareness of someone whose life has recently rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. She should have been watching the edges more carefully. She knew that afterward. She'd been watching the center, and the edges were where it was coming from. Dana was at the bakery before it opened. Nia saw her through the glass of the front door when she came downstairs at 6:15, standing on the wet sidewalk in her work coat with her phone in both hands and the expression of someone who had been awake since before they should have been. She unlocked the door and Dana came in and didn't sit down. "Seung-ho," Dana said. "Park Seung-ho. You know who that is?" "Min-jae's lieutenant. I've met him twice." "At the gala, briefly." A compact man in his mid-40s with a pleasant, forgettable face and the professional warmth of someone who had learned to make people comfortable efficiently. She hadn't thought much about him. What about him? Dana pulled out her phone and held it out. On the screen was a document, financial, dense with numbers, the kind of thing Dana navigated professionally and that Nia had to slow down to parse. This came through a contact of mine this morning, someone inside the Baco financial structure who has been nervous for a while and got nervous enough to act. Nia took the phone and looked at the document and understood fragments of it and understood enough. Fund transfers, shell company names, dates going back 14 months. The receiving end of those transfers mapped, and this was the part that sat in her stomach like cold water, directly to accounts associated with the Cheongsa Group. Yongtae Hyun's operation. Sungho has been moving money to Cheongsa for over a year, Dana said. Not large amounts. Small, consistent ones, the kind that get lost in the noise of a large organization's cash flow. And not just money. She tapped the screen, scrolling. Information, meeting schedules, security rotation details. The raid that hit the Baeko warehouse in Mapo 3 months ago? The one that cost them 4 men and a significant supply line? Someone told Cheongsa exactly when the security shift changed. Nia stood very still. He's been feeding Taehyun everything, Dana said, from the inside, for over a year. Why are you the one telling me this? Nia asked. Her voice was flat. It got flat when she was absorbing something, when the processing had outpaced the emotional response. Why didn't this go to Min-jae's people directly? It did, Dana said. My contact sent it to 2 people inside the organization simultaneously. One of them is someone my contact trusts. The other... She stopped. The other is Seong-ho himself. The bakery was very quiet. He knows someone found it, Nia said. As of approximately 4 hours ago, yes. And Min-jae. I don't know if Min-jae has it yet. My contact wasn't sure which channel would reach him first. Dana looked at her with the particular expression of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. But here's the part that concerns me most, Nia. Look at the last page. She scrolled. The last page was a different kind of document. Less financial, more operational. It took her longer to parse, and when she parsed it, she read it again to be sure. It was a brief, a target assessment. Names, locations, vulnerability windows. Her name was on it. Her address. The bakery's layout, with notes about staff hours and security camera positions. She had 1 camera, above the back door, which she'd installed after the Cheongsa incident. And the assessment of her as the document used the English phrase directly, soft point of access. The recommended window was annotated with a date, 3 days from now. Thus, she called Min-jae. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was awake, which at 6:40 in the morning meant he hadn't slept. I need to see you, she said. Now. A pause of maybe 2 seconds. Are you at the bakery? Yes. Don't open today. Stay inside. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 14. He came through the back. She'd given him the code to the alley entrance after the Cheongsa men, a practical decision she'd told herself was about efficiency and had not examined further. And he came into the kitchen with 2 men she didn't recognize flanking him, and the particular quality of controlled urgency that she was learning to read as Min-jae at a higher operational temperature than usual. She put Dana's phone on the prep counter in front of him. He looked at the document without touching it. His face did nothing. She watched it do nothing and understood that the nothing was not absence of response, but the deliberate containment of one. He looked at the last page for a long time. Then he looked up at her. How long have you had this? He asked. An hour. Dana Park. Not a question. Yes. He said something brief and quiet to one of the men behind him, who stepped out the back door immediately. Then he pulled out his own phone and began doing something on it with the focused efficiency of someone executing a sequence they'd already run through mentally. Min-jae, she said, give me 1 minute. You knew. She heard herself say it and wasn't entirely sure she'd decided to say it. Not about this specifically, but you knew something was wrong. The warehouse raid. You told me about that. You said it was... I said it was a leak. He kept his eyes on the phone. I didn't know where. Did you suspect Seong-ho? A pause that was a half-second too long. I suspected someone close. That's not what I asked. He looked up. No, he said. Not Seong-ho specifically. He's been with us since my father's time. 11 years. Something moved through his expression, not quite betrayal, which required surprise, but something adjacent to it. Something tired and old and unsurprised in the way of a man who has known all his life that the people closest to you are also the people with the most information to use against you. I should have. He has the document too, she said. He knows someone found it. I know. He put the phone in his jacket. We have a window. It's narrow. 3 days isn't narrow. It's not 3 days anymore. He looked at her steadily. The document gave a window. Seong-ho, knowing the document was found, closes that window because he'll move earlier. Tonight, possibly. Tomorrow at the latest. She stood very still while that landed. You need to leave the bakery, he said. I'm not closing Honey and Hearth. Nia, this is my business, my life. She heard her own voice go hard in a way that surprised her, an edge she hadn't known was there until it was needed. I'm not going to hide in someone's safe house while someone else decides what happens to the thing I built. His jaw worked. She could see him running calculations behind his eyes, the rapid, quiet arithmetic of threat assessment and resource and what could and couldn't be controlled. Then we stay here, he said finally, and we control the ground. She sent Dana home. Dana argued, which was predictable, and Nia was firm, which Dana respected even when she hated it. And by 8 o'clock, it was Nia and Min-jae and 4 men she didn't know positioned at intervals through the bakery that she was pretending not to notice and mostly failing. Min-jae sat at his usual table. She made coffee because the alternative was standing still, and she couldn't stand still. And she brought it to him and sat across from him, and for a long, strange moment, it was almost like the weeks before the gala. The table between them and the quiet of the shop and the low buzz of the overhead light. Except for the 2 men visible through the display case window in the car outside. Except for the weight of what was moving toward them. Tell me about him, she said. Seong-ho. Why? Because I need to understand what we're dealing with, and I learn better when I understand the person, not just the threat. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, considered it. He was my father's man first, a driver, originally. Then my father recognized he was smart, not the kind of smart that announces itself, the other kind, the patient kind, and moved him up. By the time I took over, Seong-ho was running operations coordination. He knew everything. He resents you. Min-jae looked at her. What makes you say that? 11 years working for the father. Then the son takes over, and the son is younger, and... She stopped. He didn't think you were ready. Something shifted in Min-jae's face. No, he didn't. Did he say so? Once, directly, after my father's diagnosis. He picked up the cup. I told him his opinion had been noted. We didn't discuss it again. And instead of discussing it, he started talking to Tae-hyun. Apparently. She thought about that, about the shape of it, the resentment that can't find a legitimate outlet turning into something structural, something patient, something that waits. She'd known people like that, not on this scale, but the human shape of it was familiar. He's going to use me to get to you, she said. That's the assessment. Because I'm accessible. Because I don't have your security structure. Because he thinks... She stopped. He thinks you care about me enough that threatening me creates leverage. Min-jae set the cup down very precisely. Does it? She asked. She asked it flat, without performance, because she needed the actual answer. He looked at her across the table. Yes, he said. Simple. No decorating it. She nodded, absorbed it. Then we need to make sure he can't use that. Nia. I mean, we need to take away the leverage by making sure he doesn't get to me. She leaned forward slightly. What would make him move tonight versus tomorrow? Knowing his window is closing. So if he already knows we're aware, He'll move fast and hard because the careful version is no longer available to him. She thought about the bakery, the layout she'd had 14 years of visual memory for, in her former Chicago neighborhood's bakery where she'd worked as a teenager, overlaid now with 3 years of honey and hearth's specific dimensions. The kitchen, the front counter, the back alley entrance that she'd given Min Jae the code to. The storage room with its heavy shelving. The industrial equipment. She was starting to think about the equipment. "What are you doing?" Min Jae asked. He was watching her face. "Thinking about the layout," she said. "If someone comes through the back, where do they expect resistance to come from?" "From my men. And if your men aren't the only variable in the room..." He was quiet for a moment. "Naya, you're not a..." "I know what I'm not." She met his eyes. "I'm also someone who works with industrial equipment and has been doing it since I was 16 years old. I know what boiling sugar syrup does to human skin. I know what a cast iron rolling pin weighs. I know every corner of this kitchen in the dark." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking to fight your war. I'm asking you to let me know my own ground." He looked at her for a long time. She could see the argument forming and reforming behind his eyes. "Show me," he said finally. They went through this kitchen together. She walked him through it the way she walked it herself, which was from the inside out. Starting with the main prep area, the 2 heavy marble counters and the industrial mixer and the rack of hanging equipment above the secondary station, through to the back shelving where the dry goods lived in 60-pound sacks of flour and sugar that had a combined weight she knew precisely because she moved them herself twice a month. The proofing oven and its door that swung outward. The large copper pots on the back burner, 2 of them, and the one currently loaded with a batch of honey caramel that had been on low heat since yesterday and was now at a temperature she could estimate within 10 degrees without checking the thermometer. Min Jae moved through the kitchen with her and she watched him reassess it. She could see him doing it, recalibrating the space from domestic to tactical, seeing the angles and the coverage and the choke points the way his experience made automatic. "The back door," he said, "opens inward. Swing radius is here." She marked it with her hand. "So anyone coming through it has a half-second of limited visibility. And they come through expecting an empty kitchen or a frightened woman." He was quiet. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't decide I can't handle it. I can see you deciding." "I'm deciding that I don't want you in a position where you have to handle it." "I know." She held his gaze. "But you're not always going to be 14 minutes away." That landed. She could see it land. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." They stood in her kitchen with the caramel warming on the back burner and the flour sacks stacked along the wall and the cast iron rolling pin in its slot above the prep station, and the afternoon moved slowly into early evening, and nobody came. Nobody came at 7, nobody at 8. At 9:15, Min Jae's phone lit up. She watched his face read the message, watched the temperature of him change the way the room changed when he entered it. But this time the shift was internal, something cold moving through the controlled surface of him. "They found Seong-ho's car," he said. 20 minutes from here." She breathed, slowly, through her nose. "He's not in it," Min Jae continued, still reading. "He got out on foot, which means he knows we're watching the approaches." She heard herself say it, and her voice was steady, which surprised her because her heart was not steady at all. "He has a secondary." Min Jae was already at the back door, already on his phone, running the containment sequence she could see him running without being able to follow all of it. His men outside were repositioning. She could hear it in the brief radio chatter she wasn't supposed to hear and was hearing anyway. "There's a building across the alley. He'll have..." The back window exploded. Not a bullet. A brick. And in the half-second that followed the brick and the shattering glass, something small and metal came through the broken window and hit the kitchen floor and rolled, and Min Jae's voice cut through the noise with one word in Korean that needed no translation because his body was already in motion, already covering the distance between them, and his arms came around her and turned her. The thing that came through the window was a smoke canister. She understood that a half-second after Min Jae's body folded around hers and turned her away from it, his arm across the back of her head, pressing her face toward his shoulder. And the canister hit the floor and started hissing with the mechanical patience of something designed to fill a space and disorient everything inside it. Gray smoke, thick and fast. Min-jae pulled her toward the front of the shop. She went. Her eyes were already burning, the smoke finding the soft tissue immediately, and she kept one hand on his jacket and moved when he moved and tried to breathe shallow through her mouth. Her kitchen was filling behind them. She could hear the caramel on the back burner, the low, steady bubble of it, and some part of her brain that was still running domestic calculations understood that the smoke was going to ruin it and filed that information somewhere irrelevant. They came through this kitchen doorway into the front of the shop, and Min-jae had his phone up, was talking into it fast and low in Korean, and through the front window she could see movement on the street, shadows that weren't there before. The black car was gone. "Where are your men?" she asked. "The alley," he said. "They drew them to the alley." "How many came in the back?" "I don't know yet." He moved her behind the counter, put her back against the refrigerated display case, and crouched in front of her with his phone still in his hand and his eyes moving between the front door and the kitchen doorway. "Stay down." "Min-jae, stay down." She stayed down. For about 45 seconds. Then the front window came in. Not a brick this time. Two men, fast and low, through the glass before it had finished falling, and the sound of it was enormous in the small shop. A full-body crash, safety glass exploding into cubes across her black and white tile floor, the metal frame bending inward. She was behind the counter, and they were in the shop, and Min-jae moved to meet them with a speed that her brain had trouble tracking. The economy of someone for whom this was not a new situation. The first man he hit once and hit correctly, and the man went down hard against the pastry display, which collapsed under him. The second had a weapon already up. Nia grabbed the first thing her hand found on the shelf beneath the counter, a heavy glass jar. The local honey she ordered from a supplier in Gangwon province, sold at the register, 400 grams of it. She threw it at the second man's head. She missed his head. She hit his shoulder, and it was enough. He flinched. The weapon moved. The shot that came out went into the ceiling instead of Min-jae, plaster raining down. And Min-jae closed the distance, and the second man went down too. The shop was full of smoke now, drifting through from the kitchen. "The back door," Nia said. She was on her feet. She didn't remember standing. "They're going to come through the back." "My men." "Your men went to the alley. The back door is the kitchen." She grabbed his arm. "Humble, come with me." He looked at the two men on the floor, made a calculation she couldn't follow. Then he came. The kitchen was smoke gray and getting worse. The canister had rolled under the secondary prep station and was still hissing, and the visibility was down to maybe 8 feet, which in a kitchen that was 30 feet deep meant moving by memory and contact rather than sight. Nia knew this kitchen by memory. She knew it the way she knew her own breathing, which was right now fast and shallow and tasting of whatever chemical was in the smoke. She went to the back burner first. The caramel pot was still on. The temperature gauge, which she could barely read through the smoke, had climbed while she was in the front. Stress, adrenaline. She hadn't thought about it. And now it had been unattended for 10 minutes and the temperature was significant. She grabbed the insulated handle without thinking twice about it and moved the pot to the edge of the station closest to the back door, set it where she needed it. Min-jae watched her from 2 feet away. "What are you doing?" "Setting up." She moved to the shelving along the wall, the flour sacks, 60 pounds each, and she knew exactly how they were stacked and exactly how they'd come down. If they come through that door, they're going to come through fast and low and expecting disorientation. They're going to expect people who don't know the space. "Nia, I know this space." She positioned herself at the edge of the secondary prep station, one hand on the handle of the caramel pot, the other finding the cast iron rolling pin above her on the rack. The weight of it was exactly what she remembered, 14 inches of solid iron, just over 4 pounds. She'd used it 3 days a week for 3 years. "Give me the right side, take the left." He looked at her. The smoke was between them, gray and shifting, and she could see his eyes through it, and she didn't look away from them. "Trust me," she said, "the same way I trusted you at the gala." A beat. One beat. "Right side," he said, and he moved left. The back door came in 40 seconds later. One kick, a good one, well placed from someone who'd done it before, and the door swung inward hard, bang against the wall, and they came through in the standard sequence. First man fast and low, second covering, third behind him. Professional, coordinated. They came into smoke and darkness and a kitchen that smelled of burned sugar and caramel and something chemical. And the first man had a light on his weapon, and he swung it left first because that was standard. Light to the largest threat vector, sweep left. And in the half second that he swung left and found nothing, Nia pulled the caramel pot off the burner edge and threw its contents at the space directly in front of the door. Not at the men specifically. She couldn't see them well enough for that. She threw at the space. Boiling sugar syrup at 240 degrees Fahrenheit moves fast and sticks, and the sound it made when it hit was something she was going to carry for a long time afterward. A sharp, terrible human sound from two different directions. And the light dropped, and the formation broke apart, and Min-jae came from the left side with the specific controlled violence of someone who had spent his life learning exactly how much force each situation required. The third man, the one who'd stayed back, the one who hadn't caught the syrup, the one who still had his weapon up, swung toward Naya. She hit him with the rolling pin. Not a clean hit. She was shaking. She could feel the shake in her arms all the way to her shoulders, and the smoke was in her eyes, and she was running on something that wasn't exactly courage, more like the absence of any option except forward. She caught his forearm, and the weapon discharged into the floor, and she hit him again, this time higher, and he went down on one knee, and she hit him a third time across the back of his shoulder, and he went the rest of the way down. She stood over him with the rolling pin in both hands, and her lungs burning and her vision swimming from the smoke. And she thought, "I'm still here. I'm still here." She was still here. Min-jae had the third man zip-tied with something from his jacket pocket before she'd fully processed that it was over. His movements were efficient and quick, and when he straightened up and looked at her through the smoke, his expression had the flat operational quality she recognized, and underneath it, something that was not operational at all. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked at her hands, the rolling pin. "You?" "No." She nodded, set the rolling pin down on the counter because her arms were shaking enough now that holding it felt absurd. Outside the back door, she could hear sounds, voices, movement, the aftermath of whatever had happened in the alley. And Min-jae's phone was going again, his men checking in, the communication of people reorganizing after contact. She went to the canister under the secondary station and used a pot holder to pick it up and carry it through the back door and drop it in the alley where the smoke could dissipate into open air rather than her kitchen. She stood in the alley for a moment and breathed. Actual air. The back of the bakery was a mess. Door hanging wrong on its hinges. Glass from the window still on the floor inside. The caramel she'd just weaponized splattered across a 6-foot radius of her kitchen floor in a way that was going to be a significant cleaning project. The pastry display in the front was destroyed. The front window was gone. Honey and Hearth looked like a place where something terrible had happened. Because it was. She stood in the alley and breathed and told herself not to look at the kitchen, not yet, not until she'd gotten through the next part, and she breathed. Min-jae came out beside her. "It's not over," she said. "No." Sung-ho wasn't in there. "No." He was on his phone again, listening rather than talking. His face in the alley light was hard and focused, and she could see the blood on his jacket sleeve from something she'd missed happening in the kitchen, a cut or a graze, and she decided not to ask yet. "He's running the operation from a position, not here." "Where?" "We're working on that." She turned to face him directly. "Min-jae, where is he?" He looked at her. She could see him deciding how much to tell her, and she held his gaze and waited. "The Han River Suites," he said. 42nd floor. The ballroom. Where they'd been 3 weeks ago. Where they'd stood in 500 people's judgment and walked through it together. He planned this from the hotel, she said. It wasn't a question. He has a room there, has for months. It's how he's been communicating with Taehyun's people without it appearing in the organization's traffic logs. Min-jae lowered the phone. He expected us to be contained here. That was the point of the assault. Pin us down, remove my operational capacity, leave him free to consolidate with Cheongsa. It didn't work. It didn't work here. His voice was even, and underneath the evenness was something cold and final. But my father is in a medical facility on the north side of the city, and Seong-ho knows which one, and he knows the security there is lighter than anything I have in Gangseo. The alley was very quiet. He's going after your father, she said. That's the backup, Min-jae said. If the primary failed, and the primary failed. She watched his face, the control of it, and under the control the thing that was not control, the thing that was older and rawer than any of the professional machinery she'd watched him operate with for months. His father. The dying man who had built the thing Min-jae had inherited and who was lying in a bed somewhere on the north side of the city with lighter security than his son had thought was necessary until right now. Go, she said. I'm not leaving you here. Your men are here. The 3 in your kitchen are not going anywhere. And your father... She stopped. Go. I'll be fine. Nia. Min-jae. She put her hand on his arm, felt the tension in it, the coiled readiness, the effort of staying in one place when everything in him was already moving. Go. He looked at her for a moment that was 2 seconds or a lifetime. She couldn't tell. And then he gripped her hand briefly. Not a gesture. Something more direct than a gesture, pressure and contact and intention all at once. And he went. She stood in the alley and listened to the cars pull away, and the night settle back over Gangseo district, and the distant sound of Seoul doing what Seoul always did, which was continue regardless of what any individual life was doing inside it. Then she went back inside. Demet. Her kitchen was a disaster. She stood in the middle of it and looked at it properly for the first time. The caramel splattered across the floor and the lower cabinets in patterns that were almost decorative except for what she knew they were. The flowers she'd knocked off a shelf in the confrontation dusting every surface white. The back door hanging at an angle that meant the hinges were damaged. The smoke residue on the walls and ceiling in a gray film that was going to require repainting. The proofing oven had shut itself off at some point, the safety cutoff responding to the canister smoke, which had probably saved her from a fire. 3 years. 3 years of this kitchen, and the smell of it, and the early mornings, and the particular satisfaction of a dough that had proofed exactly right, and a caramel that had reached temperature precisely, and the small daily victories that accumulated into something she'd called a life. She breathed through her nose and told herself it was repairable. All of it was repairable. She went to the front of the shop and looked at the destroyed pastry display and the missing front window and the glass in cubes across her tile floor, and she amended her internal assessment. Repairable, but not cheaply and not quickly. One of Min-jae's men appeared in the kitchen doorway, a young man she'd seen before but didn't know by name, who had the look of someone who had been through his own version of the last 40 minutes and was now running on fumes and training. He said to stay with you, the young man said, in careful, deliberate English. Until he calls. I know, she said. Thank you. She found the broom, the glass first. She needed to deal with the glass. She was sweeping the front of the shop in the open air from the missing window, the night coming in cool and carrying the smell of rain on pavement when her phone rang. Dana. She answered. Tell me you're alive, Dana said. The framing of it was light, but her voice wasn't. I'm alive. I'm sweeping glass. Of course you are. A sound that was relief and something that wasn't quite a laugh. The whole district is... Nia, I've been watching the police scanners. There are reports from Mapo and Yeongdongpo too. It's not just Gangseo. Whatever's happening, it's the whole organization, Nia said. Seung-ho didn't just target me, he moved on everything simultaneously. Silence on the line. How bad is it? Dana asked. She looked at her shop, at the glass and the missing window and the night air coming through it, at the faint smoke smell still drifting from the kitchen, at the mark on the wall where the second man's weapon had discharged into it, a black scorch mark at chest height that she was going to have to look at every day until she painted over it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. She kept sweeping. At 11:43, her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from Min Jae's number. 3 words. Father is safe. She stopped sweeping. She stood in the middle of her wrecked shop with the broom in both hands and breathed and felt the release of something she hadn't fully understood she was holding. Then a second text came. Seung-ho is in custody, but Tae-hyun moved on the Mapo facility. We have a problem. She stared at the screen. A third text. I need you to stay exactly where you are. Do not let anyone in except my men. Nia. The fourth text came through incomplete, half a sentence, the kind that happened when a phone was suddenly otherwise occupied, and she stared at the broken-off message and felt the bottom of her stomach drop because incomplete sentences from Min Jae's number at midnight while gang war moved through the city like weather meant something had changed in the last 30 seconds, something fast and unplanned, something that had interrupted him mid-word. She stood in the wreckage of Honey and Hearth, with the broom in her hands, and the night air coming through the missing window, and the smell of burned caramel in her kitchen, and her heart running fast and hard, and she waited, and waited. And then from the street outside, through the open space where her window used to be, she heard the sound of cars. Multiple. Moving fast. Not Min Jae's cars. She recognized the difference now. She had learned in the last months the particular sound of Min Jae's vehicles, the weight of them, the way they moved. These were lighter, faster, and there were more of them. She looked at Min Jae's man in the kitchen doorway, and she watched his face change as he heard it too, watched him reach for his radio and start talking fast and low, and she gripped the broom handle and thought, this is Tae-hyun. He moved on the Mapo facility as a distraction, and now he's here. She thought, I am alone in a broken building with one of Min Jae's men and a cast iron rolling pin and 60 pounds of flour and what is left of my caramel supply. She thought, I'm not going to let them have this place. Outside, the cars were stopping, doors were opening, and somewhere across the city, Min Jae was reading a broken text message and turning around, and the distance between them was every second of the next however long, and she had 6 minutes. She knew that the way she knew dough, not from calculation, but from feel, from the accumulated instinct of a woman who had spent years learning to read the temperature of a room before anything in it announced itself. The cars outside had stopped, the doors had opened. The men coming out of them were moving with the deliberate patience of people who had been told there was no rush, that the target was contained, that the building was already soft. They didn't know what was in the building yet. She turned to Min Jae's man in the kitchen doorway. His name, she'd learned in the last 2 hours, was June. He was 26, and he'd been on the phone with someone, and now he wasn't. And his face had the particular quality of a young man trying to hold a professional surface over something that was moving fast underneath it. How many can you reach? She asked. 2, maybe 3 minutes out. That's not 6 minutes. No, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He was scared and trying not to show it, and she respected that, the trying, even when the showing was obvious. Okay, she said, then it's us until they get here. She handed him the broom. He took it, confused, and she was already moving toward the kitchen, the flour first. She'd thought about this in the abstract, in the strange, suspended way her brain had been working all night, processing threat assessment in the background while she swept glass in the foreground. She'd read once, years ago, a piece about industrial accidents, the catastrophic kind, the ones that turned grain silos into craters, and the mechanism had stayed with her the way useless information sometimes did, waiting for relevance it would hopefully never find. Fine particulate suspended in air. Fuel to oxygen ratio. an ignition source. She had 60 pounds of all-purpose flour in sacks along the wall, and 2 more on the upper shelf and the gas range on the back wall that she'd been cooking on since 6 in the morning and whose pilot lights were still lit. She was not going to use it as a bomb. She was going to use it as a wall. She grabbed the first sack, the edge of it, and dragged it to the center of the kitchen floor. Cut it open with the utility knife she kept on the magnetic strip above the prep station. The flour sighed out of it in a slow white cascade, and she tipped the whole sack, 60 pounds of it, into the middle of the floor and then grabbed the second sack and did the same and then climbed to the upper shelf for the 2 smaller bags and added those. The kitchen floor disappeared under white. She went to the utility cabinet and found the industrial fan she used for cooling racks in summer and positioned it at the kitchen doorway, pointed inward, and turned it to its highest setting. The flour lifted. Not all of it, not evenly, but enough. A white suspension in the air, thick and settling and rising again in the fan's draft, turning the kitchen into something that looked like a storm system captured in a small room. Visibility inside dropped to 4 feet. Anyone coming through the back door into this would be blind and breathing flour and moving through a space that looked like the inside of a cloud. She went to the front of the shop. "Kitchen is set," she said to June. "Nobody comes through that back door without losing their orientation. When they do, you go left, I go right, same as Min-jae and I did before." June stared at her, at the white cloud visible through the kitchen doorway, back at her. "You did this on purpose," he said. "I did this on purpose." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do I do with the broom?" "Hold it like you mean it," she said. "It's heavier than it looks." They came through both doors at once, front and back, 2 seconds apart. The front door kicked in, the glass of it already gone, so it was just the frame going sideways off its hinges, and 2 men through the front while the back door came in simultaneously, and 2 more through the kitchen. The 2 in the front saw June, and behind June, the white fog of the kitchen, which made the space behind him look cavernous and strange, and obscured anything that might be in it. The half-second of reassessment that created was the half-second June used to move, fast and low, with the compact efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this, and was now running on training because thinking would take too long. In the kitchen, the 2 men who came through the back door entered a white world. They lost each other immediately. The flour cloud was denser than it had looked from outside, the fan still running, the suspension constant, and the visibility was worse than smoke because flour caught their lights and reflected it back at them in diffuse white that destroyed depth perception. She heard them, stumbling, cursing, the sound of a shoulder hitting the shelving unit she'd dragged 2 feet to the left of where it usually stood. She was behind the secondary prep counter, down low, which she knew was exactly 4 feet from the right-hand wall. She'd measured it with her body. The first man came past her. She heard him before she saw him, his boot on the flour-covered floor, the particular sound of someone moving carefully through an unknown space, and she waited until he was past her position by 2 steps, and then she stood and hit him across the back of both knees with the rolling pin, and he went down sideways into the flour-covered floor, and she was already moving before he landed, using the secondary counter as her wall, staying low. The second man was harder. He'd stopped moving when his partner went down, smart enough to freeze when the environment turned hostile, smart enough to not announce his position. She could hear him breathing, short, controlled, a professional breath, and she stayed still and breathed through her mouth, and the fan moved the flour between them in slow white waves, and for 15 seconds, neither of them moved. Then June came through the kitchen doorway with blood on his face from something that had happened in the front of the shop, and the second man's attention broke for the single second of registering a new element, and Naya threw the rolling pin. She wasn't aiming for anything specific. She was aiming at the sound of him, and at the space he occupied, and at the idea of disruption. It hit something, his arm, she thought from the sound, and he moved away from it 1 step, which brought him into the path of June, who had identified the location from the sound of the impact and was already closing. It was not graceful. It was not the choreographed efficiency of Min-jae's men. It was two people in a flower-clouded kitchen using noise and instinct and the accumulated decision-making of the last 6 months. And when it was over, both of the men from the back door were on the floor, and Nia was leaning against the secondary prep counter with flour in her hair, and her lungs and her eyes and her hands shaking hard enough that she pressed them flat to the counter to hide it. June was bleeding from his left eyebrow. Not badly, but it was bleeding the way eyebrow cuts did, enthusiastically. "You okay?" she asked. "I've been worse," he said, which she doubted but appreciated. From the front of the shop, the sound of more cars. Different cars. She knew the difference now. Min-jae came through the missing front window. Not through the doorway. Through the window space, because the doorway had a man in it, and the window space was open and faster. And he came through it with two of his men behind him, and the expression of someone who had driven across the city through a war and arrived to find the war already concluded. He stopped when he saw the kitchen. The flour was still suspended in the air, the fan still running, the white cloud drifting through the doorway like weather from another climate. The four men on the floor. June with blood on his face. Nia against the counter with flour in her hair and the rolling pin on the floor where she'd thrown it, and her hands not quite steady at her sides. He looked at all of it. Then he looked at her. "I'm fine," she said, before he could ask. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, the flour in her throat. "June needs his eyebrow looked at." Min-jae crossed the room in 4 steps, and his hands came up to her face, both of them, tilting it toward the light from the front of the shop, checking her with the methodical focus of someone who needed tactile confirmation that what his eyes were telling him was accurate. She let him. She was tired enough that the being checked felt like relief rather than intrusion. "Nia." "I said I'm fine. I know what you said." He wasn't looking at her face anymore. He was looking at her hands, which he'd taken in both of his, which was when she realized they were still shaking. "You're not fine yet. You will be." She looked down at their hands, hers in his, white flour dusted across both of them. "Tae-hyun," she said. Contained. His men at Mapo surrendered when the facility held. His operation here, Min-jae glanced at the kitchen, apparently also contained. "Where is he?" "In a room with several of my people making a calculation about his future options." His voice was flat. "He'll make the right calculation." She thought about pressing for details and decided she didn't need them. Not tonight. Tonight she had a finite amount of capacity left, and she needed to spend it on the things in front of her, which were the flour on her kitchen floor, the broken doors, the missing window, the eyebrow on June's face, and the shaking in her hands that was beginning slowly to ease. "Your father," she said. "He's safe. I had him moved before I came here." He paused. "He wants to meet you." She looked at him. "Now?" "Not now." The faintest movement at the corner of his mouth, the almost smile she'd learned to read as the realest version of warmth he had access to. "When you're ready." She looked around her kitchen, at the destruction of it, the flour and the chaos and the men on the floor being zip-tied by Min-jae's people. At the proofing oven that had shut off, the copper pots, the marble counter with its thin coating of flour dust, the magnetic strip above the prep station missing the rolling pin she'd thrown across the room. 3 years of this kitchen. It was still her kitchen. "Let's get June's face looked at," she said. Okay. The next 3 weeks were a different kind of hard. Not the acute, adrenaline-soaked hard of the night. Honey and hearth became a battlefield. The chronic kind. The kind that required showing up every day to a space that was being rebuilt and making decisions about flooring and windows and display cases while her hands were still remembering what it felt like to hold a rolling pin at 2 in the morning with men coming through her door. She had nightmares for the first week. Not dramatic ones, not the movie kind, just the one where she was in the flour cloud and couldn't find the second man, and the breathing sound kept moving, and she kept adjusting her position and never closing the distance, and she'd wake up at 4 in the morning in the apartment above the bakery, and lie there in the dark until the city started to come back to life outside. She didn't tell Min Jae about the nightmares. She wasn't ready to. She filed them under processing and got up at 5 and went downstairs and worked on the rebuilding, which she'd decided to do herself rather than hand off to contractors for the parts she could handle. The flower came up after 3 cleanings. The walls were repainted the same cream she'd chosen originally. The new display case was slightly larger than the one it replaced, which she'd decided was either an upgrade or an indulgence, and had settled on calling it both. Dana came and helped paint the walls on a Saturday, which mostly involved Dana painting very precisely and Nia painting with less precision, and both of them talking about everything except the things they weren't ready to talk about yet. And it was one of the better days of that stretch. Minji came every other day. He didn't stay long. He was managing the aftermath of the war, which was a full-time occupation, the consolidation of territory and the negotiation of new arrangements and the dismantling of what Seong-ho had built over 11 patient years. He came, had coffee, watched the rebuilding. Sometimes he helped with the physical work, which she found she didn't mind. He was good with his hands in the practical sense, the structural sense, and watching someone who operated the way he did apply himself to the problem of a door that hung wrong on its hinges had a quality she didn't quite have words for. She didn't ask what happened to Seong-ho. She asked once, indirectly, about Tae-hyun, and Min Jae told her the Chongsa group had agreed to terms, which she understood to mean the war was structurally over, even if the map was still being redrawn. She didn't ask for the details of the terms. She was building a relationship with the knowledge that the details existed and that she didn't need all of them, which was a different kind of understanding than she'd had before all this started. She'd started everything before, with Marcus, with the move to Seoul, with the bakery, believing that if she could see all of it, know all of it, map every variable, she could keep herself safe. She'd been wrong. Safety didn't come from knowing everything. It came from knowing yourself well enough to move in the dark. She'd moved in the dark. She'd done okay. But Honey and Hearth reopened on a Tuesday morning in late May. She'd thought about doing something to mark it. A ribbon, some kind of announcement, the small ceremony of a second opening. She decided against it. The bakery didn't need ceremony. It needed bread. She opened at 7. Mr. Yoon from across the street was there at 7:04, exact change in hand. Red bean pastry consumed standing at the counter the way he always had. And that was the ceremony. That was exactly the ceremony. Bora came back. She'd been apologetic about being unavailable during the rebuilding, which Nia had told her was unnecessary because she'd been told not to come in, which Bora had seemed to take only partial comfort from. She came back now with the energy of someone who had been waiting, and Nia was genuinely glad to see her, glad for the return of the rhythm of 2 people working a space that was meant for 2 people. By 10 in the morning, the shop smelled right again. The deep, particular smell of it, the browned butter and cardamom, and the yeast of proofing dough and the caramel that she'd started making again on the back burner, a fresh batch, the smell of which she was determined to associate with the product rather than the night it had become a weapon. She was in the back when the bell rang at 11, and she heard Bora do the greeting, and then a pause. And then Bora came to the kitchen doorway and said, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had been working here long enough to understand certain things, "There's a man asking for you." "Min Jae?" she asked. "Older," Bora said. He was seated at the table by the window when she came out. Not Min Jae's table, exactly. He'd chosen the one adjacent, as if he understood that the window table had a specific inhabitant, and he was arriving as a visitor. He was in his late 60s, she thought, with the architecture of what Min Jae would look like in 40 years visible in his face. The same bone structure, the same quality of absolute stillness, though his stillness had the softer quality of illness in it, the conservation of a body being careful with what it had left. He was watching her as she came around the counter. She stood at a medium distance and looked back at him. Not performing anything, just looking. "You're Nia Brooks," he said. His English was accented, careful, with the deliberateness of a man who'd spent decades having his second language interpreted for him and had therefore kept it precise. "Yes." My son says you saved his life. Your son is generous, she said. I kept him from bleeding to death on my kitchen floor. What happened after that was his. The old man was quiet for a moment. She could see him taking her in, not the way the women at the gala had, not with assessment or dismissal, but with the particular attention of someone who has been building a picture from secondary reports and is now encountering the primary source. He also says, the old man continued, that when his enemies came to use you against him, you did not run. This is my shop. Yes. Something in his face shifted. That's what he said you would say. He looked around Honey and Hearth, at the cream walls and the new display case and the photographs of Chicago on the east wall, at the small hand-painted sign above the kitchen doorway that had survived everything. Made with love, served with nerve, slightly smoke-darkened at the upper right corner but legible. Will you sit? He asked. She sat across from him. She made no move toward the counter for coffee, and he made no request for any, and they sat in the quiet of the reopened bakery with the street going about its Tuesday morning outside. I wasn't kind to him, the old man said. After his mother died, I had a business to run, and I ran it, and he grew up in the architecture of it rather than in the other thing. He stopped. His hands on the table were still, and she could see the effort of the stillness, the deliberateness. I didn't teach him how to want things for himself. She waited. You are something he wanted for himself, the old man said. Not for the organization, not for the stability question. I know what he told people. I know why he thought he needed to frame it that way. He looked at her directly. He wanted you before he understood how to say so. She held his gaze. I know, she said. And you? He asked. Simple, no ceremony around it. She thought about what she'd thought about in the alley behind the Han River Suites, standing in the rain with his hands on her face, and what she'd thought about the night she'd stood in flour and darkness and told herself, I am not going to let them have this place, and what she'd thought lying awake at 4 a.m. with the nightmare's residue still in her chest and the city coming back to life outside. Yes, she said. Me too. The old man nodded once, slow and complete, like a document being signed. Good, he said. Min-jae came at noon. He came through the front door, the new front door, properly hung, with the bell above it that she'd rehung herself and checked 3 times, and stopped when he saw his father at the table. The quality of the stop was complicated. She watched it from behind the counter and kept her expression neutral and let whatever needed to happen between them have the space for it. Something passed between them. She couldn't read all of it. Some of it was old and some of it was recent, and some of it was the specific language of men who had never fully learned to talk to each other and were arriving late at the recognition that late was still something. The old man said something in Korean, low and short. Min-jae answered, equally short, but his posture changed when he said it, something releasing in the line of his shoulders that she'd never seen released before. His father stood with the deliberate effort of a man honoring a body that was not entirely cooperating, and Min-jae came forward and helped him without being asked, which was the most unguarded thing she'd ever seen Min-jae do. Just 2 hands steadying an arm. Nothing more than that. The entire history of them was in the gesture's smallness. The old man said something to her in Korean on his way out. She caught most of it. Take care of each other. She nodded. When his father's car had gone, Min-jae came to the counter and sat on the stool across from her, which was new, the stool thing. He'd always sat at the table. And she made him coffee without asking and put it in front of him. How long have you been planning that? She asked. I didn't plan it. He asked where you were. A pause. I told him. She looked at him across the counter. He looked back at her. The shop was quiet around them, Bora in the back dealing with the afternoon prep, the street outside doing its ordinary Tuesday things. The war is over, she said. Yes. Taehyun has agreed to terms that remove Cheongsa from Gangseo permanently. His voice was flat in the way it got when he was delivering information that had cost something. His operation continues elsewhere, reduced. It was the practical resolution. And Seong-ho, a long pause, She held the counter between them and his eyes and waited. "Confined," he said. "Removed from any position of access. He won't be a problem." She understood that this was the version he was giving her. She understood that it was not the complete version. She made her peace with that in approximately 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds of deciding what she could live with and discovering it was more than she'd previously thought. "I want to remodel the kitchen," she said. He looked at her. "Now?" "Not now. When things settle." She picked up a cloth and wiped the counter, which was already clean, something to do with her hands. The layout was always slightly wrong. "The prep station is too far from the oven, and I've been compensating for it for 3 years. She stopped wiping. "And I want a bigger window back there, more light." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll pay for it." "No." "Nia." "I'll pay for it," she said. "It's my kitchen." Something moved through his expression. That particular shift around the eyes. She knew it now. She'd cataloged it over months, learned to read it the way she read dough and temperature and the signs that something was approaching its ideal state. "Yes," he said. "It is." She put the cloth down, came around the counter and stood in front of him, and the distance between them was the closest it had been in a room that wasn't dark or raining or full of smoke, and she looked at him in the ordinary Tuesday light of her reopened shop and thought, this is what it looks like. Not the rain and the alley. This, the ordinary version, the morning light version, this is the one that's real. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Okay." "The engagement, the original reason for it, the stability, your father's condition, the optics of it." She watched his face. "Is that still why?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put something on the counter between them. A ring. Simple, not theatrical. Dark metal with a single stone, fitted with the kind of precision that indicated specific measurement rather than approximation. "No," he said. "That stopped being why a long time ago." She looked at the ring, at his face, at the ring again. She thought about Marcus briefly, the way you think about a scar, aware of it, registering it, not living in it. She thought about the 12-year-old girl who'd been told she wouldn't be chosen. She thought about the woman who'd crossed an ocean and built something with flour and butter and sugar and nerve, and who had stood in the dark in her own kitchen with her hand shaking and not run. She picked up the ring. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She put it on her own finger, which was not the conventional sequence, and she didn't care, and it fit, which meant he'd had it made to fit, which meant he'd known her hand well enough to give those measurements to someone, which was its own kind of statement. She looked at it on her hand, the ordinary light, the smell of the bakery, the distant sound of Bora in the back kitchen working dough. "You're going to have to fix the front door again," she said. "The bell hangs slightly wrong. It's not loud enough." "I'll look at it. Today." "Today," he agreed. She went back around the counter. He drank his coffee. The bell above the door rang twice more before 1 o'clock, Mr. Yoon's neighbor, and then the mother with the daughter who always pressed her face against the glass. And Nia served them both and knew their orders by heart, and the little girl pointed at the strawberry tart again, and this time Nia put it in the box. "On the house," she said, "for coming back." The little girl held the box with both hands and looked up at her with the specific joy of small children receiving small, perfect things, and Nia looked down at her and thought, this is what it's for, all of it, the flower and the dark and the shaking hands and the rolling pin and the rain. All of it, for this, the ordinary, irreplaceable weight of a Tuesday morning and a child holding a strawberry tart and the bell above the door still ringing. She looked up and across the shop, and Min Jae was watching her from his stool with an expression she'd never quite seen on him before. Not the controlled flatness, not the almost smile, something underneath all of it, something unguarded and quiet and entirely his. She held his gaze. He looked away first, which was new. She filed it under progress. Well, 6 months later, a coastline. The wedding was small. She'd wanted small, and he'd understood small, which was one of the things, one of the accumulating things that she'd stopped being surprised by and started simply receiving as information about who they were together. 20 people. Dana, in a green dress, crying with the efficient efficiency of someone who had decided crying was appropriate and was committing to it. June, with the scar healed to a thin line above his left eyebrow, standing very straight in the back row. The old man in a chair at the front, with the oxygen he now needed and the absolute stillness he'd always had. Watching his son at the end of the aisle with an expression she caught once and looked away from because it was too private to observe. She wore what she wanted to wear. She'd had it made by the same designer who'd made the burgundy dress, and she'd given the instructions herself this time. No intermediary, no Ms. Cho translating her specifications into someone else's vision. She'd sat across a design table from a woman with pins in her collar and fabric samples spread like a landscape, and she'd said, "This is my body, and I want something that knows it." And the woman had looked at her for a moment and then picked up her pencil and started drawing. The dress was ivory, and it was hers. She walked down the aisle the way she walked into her kitchen at 5 in the morning, like she knew exactly where she was going and had made her peace with the distance between here and there. Her father wasn't there, was in Chicago, too sick to travel, and she carried that with her the way you carry things that can't be fixed, present, and weighted and not ruining the day. Dana had squeezed her hand before they separated, and that had been enough. Min-jae watched her come toward him. She watched him watch her. By the time she reached him, she understood that she was done with the instinct to look away. Done with the instinct to minimize the space she occupied. Done with the calculation of how much of herself was too much. She stopped in front of him, and the officiant said words, and they said words back. And when he took her hand, she felt the calluses on his palm. The specific geography of a man who had built and fought and lost and built again. And she thought, I know this hand. I've known it in the dark. I know what it's capable of. And I know what it chooses. And it chooses me. And I choose it back. The ring went on her finger over the ring she'd already been wearing for 6 months. The small crowd made the small sounds of small weddings. The coastline was gray and silver behind them, and the wind off the water moved through her dress and her hair, and she turned to face it after, just for a moment, standing next to him with her face to the open water. Cold, she said. Yes, he said. Good, she said. I like weather I can feel. He didn't say anything. He put his hand at the small of her back, not possessive, structural. The way you brace something you're not willing to see fall. She leaned into it slightly, just slightly. The amount that was honest. The water moved, the sky moved. The 20 people behind them were eating canapes that she'd specified herself. Honey brioche with 3 different toppings, because no one else was going to make the food decisions at her wedding. Later, in the car going back to the city, she fell asleep against his shoulder without meaning to, the accumulated weight of 6 months and 1 day finally finding the moment to set itself down. She was aware of it happening, the slow pull of it, the giving in, and she let it. And the last thing she was conscious of was the sound of the car on the coast road, and the weight of his shoulder under her head and his hand, still, at rest against hers in the space between them. She slept without dreaming. The city came toward them through the windshield, its lights multiplied on the wet road the way Seoul always was in the rainy season, brilliant and scattered and more itself for the reflection, and Min-jae watched it come and kept his hand where it was and didn't move. Honey and Hearth opened the next Tuesday at 7. Mr. Yoon was there at 7:04. The bell above the door rang and rang and rang.